Picture this. A man pulls his car to the shoulder of a pitch-black, empty interstate. Rain is absolutely crashing against the windshield. The engine's still running, but the passenger seat beside him, well, it's empty.
He steps out into the darkness, completely convinced he's left absolutely nothing behind. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no trace. For 38 years, he actually believed the Earth had just swallowed the truth. He thought time itself was his perfect accomplice. But here's the thing. What if that evidence never truly disappeared? What if this killer unknowingly carried the ultimate truth right inside his own body for decades? Because, as we're going to see, 40 years later, a single microscopic mistake is about to wake up. Now, just a quick mandatory notice before we get going. This explainer is a dramatization inspired by real-life criminal investigations and forensic breakthroughs. We've changed certain names, locations, and identifying details to protect privacy, so the character names you'll hear are completely fictitious. Okay, let's dive right into this explainer of echoes of evidence. Today, we're exploring the incredible science that drags hidden truths right out of the shadows. We're talking mind-blowing DNA breakthroughs, forgotten evidence, and those tiny, microscopic mistakes that killers never even knew they made. Some crimes, they just fade into memory. But evidence? Evidence never forgets. I'm your host, and today we're going to follow the very cold trail of a predator who vanished into the rainy Pacific Northwest, only to be tracked down decades later by a single, tiny fragment of plastic. So, let's set the scene. 1988, Skagit County, Washington. The Pacific Northwest back then was beautiful in a way that almost felt unreal, Dense forests, freezing cold rain, quiet roads just disappearing into this endless fog. It was the kind of place where people really trusted their neighbors, where folks left their porch lights on late into the night. Danger just felt so far away. But along Interstate 5, something was out there hunting the highway. So we have this 19-year-old student, we'll call her Clara, and she's driving home from a late-night study session. She even called her roommate right before leaving, promising she'd be home before midnight, but she never arrived. The very next morning, police discover her compact sedan completely abandoned near mile marker 42. The driver's side door was unlocked. Her purse was sitting right there, completely untouched. But investigators did find something else nearby. Something incredibly tiny. Something that looked almost meaningless at the time. A severed piece of industrial plastic. A heavy-duty zip tie, just half buried in the rain-soaked gravel. Now, you have to remember the strict limitations of forensics back in 1988. There were 0 fingerprints, absolutely no witnesses, not a single surviving footprint after that heavy storm. It was literally as if Clara had just vanished into the night. Tragically, 3 weeks later, a hunter discovered her body deep inside a really remote logging area. The medical examiner confirmed the terrible truth: asphyxiation. But the killer? He had left behind almost nothing. No blood, no hair, no fibers, and absolutely no DNA that the technology of 1988 could possibly identify. And then, it actually happened again. Another woman disappeared along Interstate 5. Then another one. And every single case was connected by one terrifying detail: those industrial zip ties. The media quickly gave this predator a nickname: the Highway Phantom. Then suddenly, as fast as they started, the killings just stopped. So what happened? Had the killer died? Was he arrested for something else somewhere far away? Or had he simply blended right back into ordinary, everyday life? If true stories like this fascinate you, if you're someone who believes that modern science can uncover truths that have been buried for decades, you'll want to stay hyper-focused on this explainer. Because, like we said, some crimes fade into history, but the evidence, it always remembers.
Fast forward to 2024. The archive awakens.
So, 36 long years have passed. The original detectives who worked the Highway Phantom case had all retired. Some had sadly passed away. Clara's story had slowly faded into local memory, becoming this cautionary tale told by parents who honestly barely remember the details themselves anymore. But deep inside the police evidence archive, Box 88F remained totally untouched, just waiting. Then, in 2024, a newly assigned cold case investigator decided to reopen the file. And it wasn't because of a sudden confession or a surprise witness. It was because forensic science itself had fundamentally changed. You see, scientists now understood something that investigators back in 1988 just couldn't. Every single time a human touches something, they leave microscopic traces behind. Tiny skin cells, sweat particles, fragments completely invisible to the human eye. Even if you're wearing gloves, mistakes happen. So, the modern laboratory began extracting this highly degraded biological material that was hidden deep inside the locking ridges of that original plastic zip tie, material that somehow survived nearly 4 decades. Now, traditional DNA testing failed almost immediately. The sample was just way too damaged, too fragmented, too old. For the forensic world of the 1990s or even early 2000s, this would have been the absolute end of the road. But this wasn't the 1990s anymore. To solve this giant puzzle, scientists turned to a total game changer: whole genome sequencing. This is a technology powerful enough to literally rebuild shattered genetic fragments piece by piece. Instead of just looking at a few genetic markers, the machine analyzes billions of genetic letters across the entire human genome. For 48 straight hours, the processors ran without stopping. Then, suddenly, the screen changed. The highway phantom finally had a genetic profile.
Still in 2024, let's look at the family tree of a ghost. But investigators immediately slammed into another huge roadblock. That new DNA profile? It didn't match anybody in the National Criminal Database, which means the killer had never been arrested, never convicted. He was never entered into the system. So how on earth do you find someone who officially just doesn't exist? Well, the case was handed over to an investigative genetic genealogist. Her job is totally different from traditional detectives. She doesn't hunt suspects, she hunts bloodlines. She took that genetic profile and uploaded it into public ancestry databases. Within just hours, this system actually identified distant relatives scattered all across the country: a second cousin in Oregon, a great aunt in Ohio. And that's when the real investigative work began. Tracking birth records, marriage certificates, obituaries, digging through census documents stretching back nearly a whole century. The family tree just grew larger and larger. 200 names, 300, over 400 possible relatives. And then, suddenly, all those branches converged onto a single family living in Skagit County right during the late 1980s. A family with 2 sons. Now, the older brother had a completely airtight alibi, but the younger son?
We'll call him Vance Mercer. Back in 1988, Vance was 26 years old. He worked as a refrigeration contractor. He was quiet, unremarkable, absolutely no criminal record. But here's the absolute kicker. His work van carried thousands of those exact industrial zip ties every single week. And his route? Interstate 5. Every single night.
Moving into 2025, the surveillance.
By 2025, Vance Mercer was 63 years old. He was a grandfather, a volunteer at his local church. Honestly, he was the kind of guy his neighbors always described as helpful. Nobody looking at him would ever, in a million years, imagine what investigators were beginning to suspect. But as you know, suspicion isn't enough for an arrest. Detectives needed modern DNA, real, fresh DNA to prove it. So they just waited. 4 long days passed. Nothing. Then, on a really cold Thursday evening, Vance stepped outside his house carrying a soda can. He casually finished the drink, dropped the can into a public recycling bin on the curb, and just walked right back inside his house. He had absolutely no idea that his entire life had just changed forever. Just minutes later, undercover officers swooped in and retrieved that can. The laboratory worked through the entire night. Technicians carefully extracted epithelial cells right from the rim of the aluminum, and then they compared them against that DNA they found hidden inside the zip tie from all the way back in 1988.
The match was absolutely perfect. The statistical probability of an error? 1 in 7.2 billion. Wrap your head around that for a second. Which brings us to 2026. The echo returns. When officers finally arrived at Vance's home, he didn't run, he didn't fight them, he didn't even try to deny anything. He simply stared at the handcuffs sitting right there on his kitchen table, totally silent. For nearly 40 years, he genuinely believed he had escaped the storm. He had literally watched the original detectives retire, watched witnesses disappear, watched families lose all hope. But he completely underestimated one crucial thing: the undeniable patience of science. In March of 2026, Vance Mercer was convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder. And right there inside the courtroom gallery, Clara's surviving relatives held up a photograph, frozen in time. 19 years old, forever. You know, we so often like to believe that darkness hides the truth, that if enough time passes, it can somehow erase guilt, that the past just stays buried. But molecules don't forget, evidence doesn't forget. The highway phantom fully believed the rain had washed his sins away forever. But evidence remembers, because every single crime leaves an echo. The only question is, who is listening?